As the United States entered the late 19th century and early 20th century, one of the hallmarks of the period is the rise to empire, that the United States busts out of its provincialism and begins the acquisition of extraterritorial colonies. That's predicated upon, you can't take it out of time and place. You have to have the Industrial Revolution. You have to have the champions of industry and the rise of steel and the rise of big oil. But the United States expanding westward, in other words, you might even be able to say completing Columbus's voyage. What was it that Columbus was looking for in 1492? He was looking for a route to the Orient. He was looking for a way to the riches of Asia. What did he find? He found a continent. Even though at that point, it's unclear, probably his fourth voyage, he realized it was a continent in the way. But the Americas were unwanted at the time. What was wanted, and we see all through the colonial period, even as late as the early Republic, a little known fact, but Lewis and Clark, as they voyaged westward, one of their secret orders was if they found a river that connected the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean, they were immediately to build a fort. So this idea of westward expansion and reaching the Orient had been a part of American history from 1492 onward. The transcontinental railroads make that possible. But as the nation is linked by rail, so too the nation is going to begin looking outside of itself for new worlds to conquer, if you prefer. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so in the 19th century, there are a number of authors that build this idea. Now remember, as historians, we're looking in retrospect. We're looking at the past, and we're looking at, and I'm cherry-picking key people out and saying, this is what they accomplished. This is what they were writing about, and this is what fueled the passion, fueled the soul, fueled the writings of American newspapermen, American magazine, and American populace. The first of the imperialist writers, if you will, and he's not known for being an imperialist. He's not known for his colonialism. Is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, and not his Origin of the Species, but his other book, The Descent of Man, written in 1871. He said the following: "There is apparently much truth in the belief that the wonderful progress of the United States, as well as the character of the people, are the results of natural selection, the more energetic, restless, and courageous men from all parts of Europe having immigrated during the last 10 to 12 generations to that country and having there succeeded best." So Darwin's theories of natural selection, and think about it, it makes sense. What was the colonial experience? Is it the happy and the content who go to the frontier of America? Is it the comfortable and the affluent who board ship and travel to Jamestown, who travel to Plymouth, who travel to Maryland or South Carolina? No, it's the discontent, it's the landless, it's the poor, it's those hardy people who go out to the frontier and survive. The weak are winnowed out. The weak die off. They don't survive that first winter. They don't survive the decades-long isolation, the lack of food, the lack of shelter. And so the weak die off. And what Darwin says is, looking at America, you see this rise to prominence of a hardy people, the pull yourself up by your own bootstrap mentality. That I am my own master. I will take care of myself. The rugged individualist. And so, built on the theories of Darwin, which we'll see in other venues begin to take on a social aspect of their own, in which social Darwinism is emphasized. Charles Darwin's writings, not only in The Descent of Man, but in other writings, promotes the idea that the American continent, the American nation, is going to be dominant in a future conflict. What he calls the final fight for resources, the final struggle for survival. It would be other men who took Darwin's initial theory and Darwin's initial ideas and disseminated them amongst the populace. Men like John Fiske. John Fiske, if there is such a thing as a popular historian, John Fiske was one of those. He was a historian that took the ideas of Darwin and gave them historical foundation. He traveled the country giving thousands of speeches, mixing history and Darwinian philosophy and social Darwinism to demonstrate that America was poised for greatness. In fact, John Fiske, in his book, American Political Ideas, viewed from the standpoint of universal history, looks at American history and its origins in English history, and he says that the English race. Now you have to be cautious with all of these writers because they are writing in a purely racist but unconscious racist manner. They don't know really to question that their words, their ideas are offensive. Don't put 2015 values or 2016 values back on historians and writers of the 1870s, and in the case of John Fiske, 1885. So he uses these terms and it takes on a different meaning today than what he intended. But he said the English race was destined to dominate the globe in the institutions, traditions, and language, even in the blood of the world's peoples. Now there's a couple of ideas in Fiske that you want to look at. The idea that the English race is destined. Have we seen that term used before in American intellectual movement? Well, certainly in the 1840s, and the idea of manifest destiny. Let me posit a question. What happened to all of those advocates of manifest destiny? When in 1840s and 1849 specifically, the United States acquires and expands to California, and by the 1850s, California is admitted as a state, and we begin to color in the continental United States. Those advocates of manifest destiny who said the United States was designed by God to expand from Atlantic to Pacific. What happened to them when that was accomplished? Let me give you a side idea. What happens to any intellectual movement when its goals are accomplished? Do they just fade away, disappear? No. They find a new idea and they cling to that and bring it to the forefront. That's exactly what happens to these advocates of manifest destiny. By the Civil War, their ideas are accomplished, but they're still around. And so I will argue that the manifest destiners become the imperialists. Their children and grandchildren take those ideas of it's meant by God for us to expand from sea to sea, to now it's meant by God for us to expand to the world, to conquer those not new worlds, but old worlds. And so John Fiske says that we are destined to dominate the globe. So borrowing from those ideas of manifest destiny, he then gives us some very specific areas that we are destined to dominate the globe in the institutions, in the traditions, in the language. Let me be just a little wild and crazy here and argue that maybe Fisk knew what he was talking about. And I know that's not cool in today's world. Fisk is seen as an ultra racist and attacked from every quarter, probably rightly so. But take what he said there. Do American institutions dominate the globe? How about Starbucks in Baghdad? The irony there is the Crusaders who first came in contact with this beverage known as coffee or kave, they did so in the Middle East. So the idea that the crusading knights take the idea of coffee back to Europe and then transplants it to the United States, and from the United States, we're now back in the Middle East selling them coffee at Starbucks. Tad bit of irony there. What about McDonald's? McDonald's even in New Delhi, where most of the inhabitants don't even eat meat. So in the institutions across the board, the United States has, now you can argue our day has come and gone, that we're an empire in decline, but Fisk was right on the money that we would come to dominate. Now whether we stay dominant or whether we decline, that's a whole different issue. But our institutions came to be worldwide institutions. Our tradition, our language. You enter the field of engineering, enter the field of air traffic control. There are numerous fields that the language around the globe is English. Even in the blood of the world's peoples. And that's a tad too, there are going to be later fascists that borrow that idea, but this was a very common concept in the 19th century, that the life of a people, the existence of the people existed in the blood. And so whether rightly or wrongly, some of his ideas seem to have strength. Taking it even one step further than John Fisk would be Josiah Strong. Josiah Strong, in his book, Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis, adds to this idea that it is our destiny to dominate the world's institutions and the world's commerce and the world's trade. He adds the sanction of religion. Josiah Strong was a Presbyterian minister, and he argues that it is the Anglo-Saxon, the English race, if you will, who gives to the world two specific civil liberties. Two specific ideas. Civil liberty and pure Christianity. He said, and I quote, and this is a rather extensive quote, but it ties a lot of these ideas together. He said, and I quote, "It seems to me that God, with infinite wisdom and skill, is training the Anglo-Saxon race for an hour sure to come in the world's future. Heretofore, there has always been in the history of the world a comparatively unoccupied land westward, into which the crowded countries of the East have poured their surplus populations. But the widening waves of immigration, which millennia ago rolled east and west from the valley of the Euphrates, meet today on our Pacific coast. There are no more new worlds. The unoccupied arable lands of the earth are limited and will soon be taken. The time is coming when the pressure of population on the means of subsistence will be felt here as it is now felt in Europe and Asia. Then will the world enter upon a new stage of its history, the final competition of the races." And you can translate that from his 19th century language. Races, he could be meaning nations. You could interpret it that way. So allow me the freedom to change it just for the sake of argument. The final competition of nations, for which the Anglo-Saxon, substitute American, is being schooled. Long before the 1,000 million are here, the mighty centrifugal tendency inherent in this stock and strengthened in the United States will assert itself. Then this race of unequaled energy, with all the majesty of numbers and the might of wealth behind it, the representative, let us hope, of the largest liberty, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization, having developed particularly aggressive traits calculated to impress its institutions upon mankind, will spread itself over the earth. If I read not amiss, this powerful race will move down upon Mexico, down upon Central and South America, and out upon the islands of the sea, over upon Africa and beyond. And can anyone doubt that the result of this competition of races will be survival of the fittest? End quote. Darwin's theory come full circle, as presented by Darwin himself, and then John Fiske, and finally Josiah Strong. Competition, that the world is going to reach a point that it's run out of resources and it's a fight for survival. And that's exactly what began in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. You can see the cartoon from Puck that I put on the slide, with China laying on the block, and the Russian bear, and the British lion, and the German eagle, all of them hovering around the carcass of China, going to carve it up for their specific purposes. In fact, what will be World War I, if not a struggle between empires? And so you have this idea, this concept that resources are running out and we have to go establish our stake and prove the vibrance of American institutions. This probably is then presented in a textbook format by no one better than Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan is the son of a professor who was key in establishing West Point. But Alfred Thayer Mahan went into the Navy and served as a captain in the U.S. Navy. But he's more known for his theories. In fact, his most important treatise was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. I would argue that outside of the Bible, outside of religious literature, this was the most important book written at the end of the 19th century. Why do I make that argument? Because it's a recipe for empire. What Mahan says is, looking back at the flow of history, even if you go back, and other works of his go beyond the dates he puts on this specific work, but if you go back to the beginnings of the first empires, the Greeks and the Romans, what were they? To be great, they had to be sea powers. They had to learn to dominate the oceans, or in this case the Mediterranean, but applying it to our day, he would say the oceans. One of the examples of this is written in the Greek classic by Xenophon, the 10,000. In that Greek classic, a Greek general, Xenophon is part of an expedition that goes deep into Persia to unseat the Persian king. From those of you who've watched popular culture and popular shows, the most recent being that horrid movie 300. Not horrid in action, but horrid in historical presentation. But from that you see the general idea that Persia, expanding into the Mediterranean world, had come into conflict with Greece. And after a series of wars between Greece and Persia, the Greeks send an army supporting a pretender to the Persian throne, going to overthrow the Persian king. In the climactic battle with 10,000 Greeks deep in Persian territory, the pretender to the throne that the Greeks support is killed in battle. Trapped deep in Persia are 10,000 Greeks who have to make their way home. And as Xenophon writes, for a Greek, all he has to do is find a body of water. When the Greeks can find water, they can get home. so too Mahan, building from that idea, is that the true origins of national greatness lie in control of the seas. Ironically, he's preaching to a nation that has ignored the seas. The United States went from being one of the dominant naval powers during the Civil War. By 1865, the United States had hundreds of ships. One of the mightiest navies the world has ever seen belonged to the United States. But as soon as the Civil War was over, the United States began letting its fleet lapse to the point that, as one reviewer wrote in the Army-Navy Journal, he said that the United States Navy in the 1870s and the 1880s had become, and I quote, a heterogeneous collection of naval trash. The United States Navy, in a Jane's Naval Survey of the 1880s, ranked the United States Navy number 15th in the world. Number 14 was that mighty naval power of Chile. The United States Navy was an embarrassment. And Mahan says in The Influence of Sea Power Upon History that the United States had to build a world-class navy. Here's the irony of Alfred Thayer Mahan's book. While there are those in the United States that pays attention to it, men like Theodore Roosevelt, men like Senator Albert Beveridge, men like Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, it is in fact the Kaiser of Germany, the Emperor of Japan, the King of Italy, the King of England, the President of France that take more interest in Alfred Thayer Mahan than American leaders. Alfred Thayer Mahan's Influence of Sea Power Upon History is translated into virtually every modern language. And it became a recipe for expansion. In fact, one of my favorite opening scenes of any movie at any time, and because of constraints of copyright laws, I can't play the opening part of it, but in the movie 55 Days in Peking, a Charlton Heston movie about Imperial Russia, the international community inside what was then Peking, today's Beijing, all of them have their embassies as they vie for control of China. And the opening scene of the movie, there are these two elderly Chinese men eating their morning breakfast over a noodle cart. And as they sit around the noodle cart eating, each of the nations within the foreign quarters begins playing their national anthem and raising their flag at the same time. And so you have La Marseillaise. The United States doesn't even have a national anthem, so they're just playing Reveille. God Save the Queen and Deutschland über alles. The various national anthems are all playing at the same time, and one of the old men is trying to stuff wool into his ears and block the noise, and he says, "What is this?" And the other man replies, "This is the nations of the world fighting over China." All of that comes about because of Alfred Thayer Mahan's book. It becomes a recipe for the conquesting empires. The volume was published in 1890. It was the collection of a series of lectures. And he argues that national greatness and national prosperity follow from a powerful navy. And he said that navies do 8 things for a nation, specifically the United States. So the first 5 things apply to all nations. The last 3 apply specifically to the United States. First off, he said that any nation that wants to be great has to have a powerful navy, a modernized navy, a fleet that can go out and, to borrow a phrase, reach out and touch somebody. Now, a navy has to do so. You don't have a navy just for the purpose of having a navy. What does a navy do? Well, number 2, that navy guards your merchant marine, your commerce fleet. So your Navy patrols the sea lanes to prevent other nations from interfering with your trade. And then what is that merchant marine doing? Well, it's engaged in number 3, foreign commerce. You realize men like John Rockefeller. What was John Rockefeller? We've had this before. John Rockefeller was the oil tycoon. He built the monopoly of Standard Oil. But his precursor to the gasoline era, a barrel of oil was refined to mostly kerosene. And it was kerosene that was seen as the valuable product because it provided lighting to America before the electric light. John Rockefeller, as a business tactic, shipped thousands, tens of thousands of kerosene lanterns to China and had them freely distributed amongst the populace. Why? Because he was the only provider of kerosene. Thus, his foreign commerce, his kerosene, would travel on American ships guarded by the American Navy, which would then bring money and revenue into Standard Oil, which would then be passed on through wages to the United States, and hence national greatness is tied to that commerce. Fourth, Mahan said, a nation that wants to be truly great must have colonies. Colonies that expand beyond your borders. Ask yourself a question. Why did Great Britain seek American colonies? Why did France seek American colonies? Why did Spain seek colonies in the Americas? Why did Portugal seek a colony in South America? All colonial powers in establishing colonies have wanted to do key things. Gain access to natural resources. Then as the colony grows, it becomes a source of commerce. The people in those colonies buying from the mother country. The colony becomes a population valve. The colony becomes a source of national pride. And the colony is placed in a strategic location to project national power. Those are the reasons to have colonies. And Alfred Thayer Mahan says, a nation that wants to be truly great will have colonies to bring in those cheap resources, a place for discontents to go and live if necessary, a place for selling your goods, and a place to show the world you're really great. And then fifth, in those colonies, you establish naval bases for that fifth reason that we just talked about, power projection. So, running through the ideas of Mahan for the world, a powerful navy, a strong merchant marine, foreign commerce, colonies, and naval bases. But then he goes on and he says for the United States to be truly great, for the United States to reach imperial status, to have the wealth of the world pouring into American markets, it needed to do 3 other things. First, it needed to control the Caribbean. Why? Well, if you look at a map of the Western Hemisphere, the Gulf of Mexico is like a huge envelope with the mouth of that envelope at the Caribbean. Whoever controls the Caribbean controls the Gulf of Mexico. Whoever controls the Gulf of Mexico then controls the approaches to his next point. For national greatness, you must build, the United States must construct an Isthmian Canal. Now, I said Isthmian Canal. I didn't say Panama Canal because at this point in time, we don't know where that canal is going to be. There is the idea of building it through Panama, but Panama seemed to be too rocky, too mountainous, too dangerous. And there had already been a French company that tried to build a canal and failed. Whereas just to the north, there's Nicaragua. And Nicaragua seems to have a more secure and safe and easier to construct. Yes, it's longer, but it would be easier and safer to build. So build an Isthmian canal. So if you control the Caribbean on one side, you build the canal, then you also have to control the other side, which in this case is the Pacific Ocean. So Mahan's last point for national greatness is the United States must build and control the South Pacific, must build naval bases and control the South Pacific. Now, Alfred Thayer Mahan is, I think, the greatest of the theorists, but there are two other men who also, in lesser degrees, advocate imperialism. Brooks Adams, the great-grandson of John Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams. Brooks Adams wrote a book called The Law of Civilization and Decay. And what he says is nations, without being aware of it, nations go through cycles. And that we see from the beginning of time, nations rising to prominence and then beginning to collapse. And while he's not an advocate of empire, in fact, quite the opposite, he's going to be an anti-imperialist, his writings are still used by the imperialists to say one of the ways to stave off the decline of American civilization, the ways to prevent the decline of American power, is to expand. To be forever expanding and not allow an implosion of American institutions. And so the law of civilization and decay. And all these books, by the way, are usually in the public domain. I know I've gotten a lot of them off of Google Books for free. And they make for interesting reading, both to argue for and to argue against. Just accept that you don't have to argue for or against. Accept what they wrote affected those who were in their audience. And then, last but not least, the great historian Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, while the world was absorbed in the Chicago World's Fair, the Chicago Exposition, we've talked about this before, the 1893 Chicago Exposition was where George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla's alternating current was used to light up the fair, and the world saw electrical light and the application of electrical light for the first time. But at that same fair, right down the road, with everybody at the fair rather than at the conference of the American Historical Association, Frederick Jackson Turner presented a paper called The Significance of the Frontier in History. Building on the ideas of Darwin, building on the ideas of Fiske and Strong, he says the frontier is what made America unique. The frontier is what gave America its specialty. That always in American life there had been that place westward for people to go to. Just this morning I was lecturing in colonial America, and we were talking about where the idea of the West and utopia came to coincide, and that was in the writings of Sir Thomas More. But for Americans, the West always was considered the place available for you to flee to, the place for you to go. That, okay, you might be a failure in New York City, but if you could just go to Chicago, you would find your wealth. Or if you could just make it to California in the gold rush, you would find your wealth. And everything would change. Your life would turn around. The West came to symbolize success. But Frederick Jackson Turner said, in looking back, every 10 years ending in 0, we take a national census. And he said, looking back at the 1880 census, we could still see that there was a distinctly American frontier. Now, follow me here. From 1607 and Jamestown, as Americans moved westward, there had been a frontier line closing in and then stagnating on the Mississippi River. Then jump ahead to 1840s and the victory in the Mexican-American War, and the United States takes California. 1849, there's a little team in California called the 49ers. They're named that because of 1849, the discovery of gold, and the gold rush is set off. And a new frontier pops up. So at one point in the United States, from 1850 to 1860 to 1870 to 1880, we had two frontiers, east and west. In each decade, they moved closer and closer together. In 1865, the railroad makes it possible to bridge the Mississippi River, and the transcontinental railroads began dropping population all along their route. So that in 1880, Frederick Jackson Turner says, we can still see a frontier line, but in 1890, there is no more frontier. There are pockets of civilization everywhere. There are pockets of people. There's no determinable frontier line. And he posits the question, how will we change because there is no more frontier? Will the United States be transformed by the fact their frontier has disappeared? Because he said, the expansive care, and I quote, the expansive character of American life will continually demand a wider field for its exercise. End quote. Americans are going to look for and turn to new worlds to conquer. And it's with that that these new young imperialists rise to power. Men like Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, a New Yorker that spends time out on the frontier on his ranch in the Dakotas and comes back filled with frontier enthusiasm and a desire for American greatness. And oh yeah, by the way, he regularly had coffee and breakfast and evening meals with none other than Alfred Thayer Mahan. And into their group, Senator Albert Beveridge from Indiana, an expansionist. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, who will become Senate Majority Leader. In fact, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge will write an article entitled, and I quote, "Our Blundering Foreign Policy." And look how he ties these ideas together. This was published in March of 1895 in the magazine American Nation in the Modern Era. And he said the following, and I quote, "Small states are of the past and have no future. The great nations are rapidly absorbing for their future expansion and their present defense all of the waste places of the earth. It is a movement which makes for civilization and the advancement of the race. As one of the great nations of the world, the United States must not fall out of line of march. From the Rio Grande to the Arctic Ocean, there should be but one flag and one country. In the interest of our commerce, we should build the Nicaraguan Canal, and for the protection of that canal and for the sake of our commercial supremacy in the Pacific, we should control the Hawaiian Islands and maintain our influence in Samoa. England has studied the West Indies with strong places which are standing menace to our Atlantic seaboard. We should have among those islands at least one strong naval station, and when the Nicaraguan Canal is built, the island of Cuba will become an American necessity." End quote. You see how Senator Lodge ties all of those ideas together into a coherent foreign policy. Agree with it, don't agree with it. That is the guiding force, and he is in the Senate and capable of making it happen. Especially when you put a president in power who agrees with it. Let me leave you with the quote from Senator Cullum of Illinois. He stated it far more simply, and this is, whereas the ideas of Mahan and Strong and Fisk might be talked about over brandy and cigars at the local club, in the bowling alleys and the homes of the common people, Senator Cullom expresses their vision, and he says, and I quote, "It is time that someone woke up and realized the necessity of annexing some property. We want all this Northern Hemisphere, and when we begin to reach out to secure these advantages, we will begin to have a nation. And our lawmakers will rise above the grade of politicians and become, for once, true statesmen." And so we will now look at how that came about. How Mahan and these other philosophers' ideas were put into practice, and the United States went from a sleepy third-tier power to one of the top powers of the world.